Greetings. This series of videos is about female sexual anatomy and response. We're going to start by looking at the internal female anatomy. So, just as a reminder, we've covered the male anatomy and sexual response, and now we're going to be talking about female. The internal anatomy consists of the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, uterus, cervix, and vagina, and the external anatomy consists of the vulva. Now, let's start with the ovaries. At birth, anyone possessing ovaries already has millions of eggs. The eggs, also known as oocytes, contain DNA and organelles and nutrients and everything by the time it's released from the ovary, everything that the developing zygote, if it's fertilized, will need. There are two ovaries, and generally speaking, they take turns with ovulation, the left one working 1 month and the right one releasing an oocyte the next month. So these are the eggs, and as you can see, there's an envelope, a pink cluster of cells around each oocyte that gets bigger as we move along. This is representing maturation. The oocytes themselves also mature as we move along from left to right in this diagram. The pink cells that you see, they're not actually pink, but the cells that you see surrounding each oocyte are known as the follicle. So they're like a protective envelope. And the cells of the follicle mature as well prior to an oocyte being released in the process of ovulation. So they nourish the oocytes and they also protect them. The other thing that you'll see here is that when they're immature, there's no real space between the egg and the follicle, but as it matures, fluid accumulates inside the follicle, and that's what makes it possible when the follicle gets to the outside of the ovary to be able to release the oocyte. The fluid sort of separates it from the part that's going to remain behind. Now, this part that remains behind from after an egg has been ovulated, this follicle becomes glandular, which means that it begins secreting hormones. And now we call it the corpus luteum. Corpus means body, luteum means that the light can shine through. This corpus luteum is important because it secretes estrogen and progesterone, which we will talk about when we get to the female reproductive cycle. Okay. Now, eggs, unlike sperm, can't swim. So the eggs rely on structures in the female reproductive tract in order to get to their final destination. The first part, or the first structure that's important, is called or are called the fimbriae. These are finger like structures that make a motion kind of like this when they sense that the ovary is about to release an oocyte. And that helps to pull the oocyte into the uterine tube. The uterine tube or the fallopian tube is lined with something called cilia. Cilia are these finger-like structures that make a sweeping motion. And that sweeping motion, sort of like watching a beach ball bounce around at a concert, that sweeping motion of the cilia moves the oocyte towards the body of the uterus. Now, one of the interesting things about cilia is that they are inhibited by cigarette smoke. Now, many of you may already know this because the cilia in the respiratory tract get damaged by cigarette smoke, and this is part of what makes the mucus accumulate and gives people that smoker's cough. But what's interesting is that as a woman smokes a cigarette, the cilia, even in the fallopian tubes, immediately stop with the sweeping motion, even though they're not in direct contact with the smoke that's being inhaled. And because of that, women who smoke are much more likely to have ectopic pregnancies. Ectopic means outside of the ordinary location. Ect is outside, tope is location, like a topographic map. So if an egg is fertilized and it's being moved along, but the smoke is inhibiting the cilia, the resulting zygote, the developing embryo, is likely to implant before it reaches the body of the uterus, causing an ectopic pregnancy, which typically are not viable. This is also, the uterine tube is also where surgical sterilization takes place. So this is known as tubal ligation. Ligate means to tie. Um, so in order to prevent pregnancy permanently, the uterine tubes are cut and each end is tied. That means that while sperm can still get in, they cannot reach the egg, and nor can the egg reach the sperm or the uterus. All right, let's talk about the uterus. The uterus is about preparation and about power. The power comes from a layer of the uterus known as the myometrium. The myometrium is the muscle layer. Myo means muscle. This is an involuntary, smooth muscle, meaning it's not under our conscious control. And this is the muscle that is important in labor and childbirth. It's also what contracts during orgasm, and it's responsible indirectly for menstrual cramps. In menstrual cramps, when this smooth muscle contracts, trying to push the layer of the uterus out that comes out during each menstrual cycle, as the smooth muscle squeezes, it squeezes on these blood vessels that deprives this muscle layer of oxygen, and our body's signal when it's not getting enough oxygen is to produce pain. So that pain sensation that comes with menstrual cramps is really because the muscle is contracting and choking itself off of the oxygen supply that it needs. Now, I didn't realize I hid the label. The next layer I want to talk about is the endometrium. Endo means inside. And the endometrium has two layers, which we can't really see here. But one of them is the one that builds up and then it is shed with each menstrual cycle. That is called the stratum functionalis. Stratum means layer, functionalis means functional. So this is the one that actually is nourishing and supporting the developing embryo if that happens. The layer underneath that is called the stratum basalis, and that does not disappear. It is the basal or the base layer. It is the layer that produces the stratum functionalis again with each new cycle. At the bottom of the uterus is a structure known as the cervix. The cervix is the opening to the uterus. It changes its position and its shape throughout the menstrual cycle, and it also produces its own secretions, which vary through the menstrual cycle. It changes when ovulation is occurring, it changes prior to menstruation, but the main role of the cervix is really to create a barrier between the outside environment, which we get to through the vagina, and the internal environment of the uterus. And generally speaking, the cervix is blocked with mucus that it secretes. This mucus disappears with each time ovulation happens, sort of to allow sperm to come in and meet the egg. But the rest of the time it's blocked with mucus, which theoretically prevents infections from going from the vagina into the uterus, where it could cause more long-term damage and possibly make reproduction impossible. Okay, the vagina is more than just a tube. It's generally about 8 to 10 centimeters long. That's 3 to 4 inches, but it's distensible. It can change both in width and length. Distensible means able to be stretched. Um, these lines that you see here are known as rugae. And just like if you take off a pair of sweatpants and there's no longer a body holding the waistband open, if you look at the fabric, it's wrinkled because the elastic is causing the fabric to gather. The rugae are the result of the same thing. So the fact that there are rugae there means that the vagina can actually stretch. There's extra fabric, if you will, in there to allow that to happen. Also, the vagina is muscular. It doesn't have the same amount of muscle all the way through, but it is muscular, and it too contracts, especially during orgasm. Now, the epithelium, or the innermost layer of the vagina prior to puberty, is just a single thin layer of cells that's quite fragile. But with puberty, the hormones of puberty cause the lining of the vagina to become multiple layers, very much like our skin. And what that means is that if there is any sort of abrasive activity, say like sex, because there are multiple layers of skin, anything that's rubbing on the lining of the vagina and actually causing enough friction will cause the outermost cells to come off, but the innermost layer will still be protected. So this resistance to abrasion gives the vagina greater protection in more than one way, actually. So because it now has multiple layers of cells, the outermost layers that come off as they die, those become food, or a food source for bacteria that naturally live in the vagina. Those bacteria consume the skin cells and, as a waste product, produce acid. And as it turns out, that acid makes the vagina inhospitable, or an unwelcome place for other kinds of bacteria. So by changing the lining, the vagina is protected not just from abrasion, but also from potentially infectious bacteria. Not all of them, of course, but for many. Finally, the vagina is not just there to change shape, but it also produces the bulk of lubrication that takes place during arousal. The process is known as sweating. And if you've ever watched your face or somebody else's on a hot, humid summer day where you can see little beads of sweat on the forehead or the upper lip, that is what's going on in the vagina. It's not to cool the body, but it is there to actually produce lubrication or to prevent friction. But counter to what we believed decades ago, that there were only a few specific glands that produced lubrication, now we know that the entire vagina participates in it and actually produces the bulk of it. Oh, I forgot my labels again. There's vagina. Okay, let's look at some more of the internal anatomy. This picture is looking at a sideways view of a female adult. This is her belly, this is her butt. And we can see an ovary. Now we know that there are two, but because we're only looking at one side, we only see one. That ovary is connected to, or it's connected to the uterus, but leads to the uterine tube, which at the end of it has the fimbriae that pull the egg in. That uterine tube attaches to the uterus. We can't really see the attachment here. But I will point out that this is the endometrium of the uterus, and this is the myometrium, the muscle layer. And if we compare that to the bladder, which I'll show you in a moment, you can see that the uterus is much thicker because it's got to push out something a lot bigger than just some liquid urine. All right, at the base of the uterus is the cervix, which controls that opening. And then leading from the uterus to the outside of the body is the vagina. And here you can see the rugae very well. Underneath the uterus, we have the bladder, which collects and stores urine until we're ready to eliminate it from the body. The tube, known as the urethra, that brings the urine to the outside of the body, and right here, the urethral opening. The urethral opening and the vaginal opening are actually quite close together, though it does vary from woman to woman. However, just to point out that there are two separate openings in female anatomy for sexual purposes and waste purposes, as opposed to in male anatomy where the urethra is shared by both. All right. We can't really see the external anatomy very well in this diagram, but here is one of the labia minora, and here is one of the labia majora, the inner and the outer lips. And we can see the clitoris. This is the part of the clitoris that's visible, but the clitoris actually extends well into the body, and the part that's internal is known as the crura. Oops. And another thing to point out here is what's known as the G-spot. The G-spot is not an actual structure that if you were dissecting, you could find and say, well, haha, here's the G-spot. It's not like that. The G-spot is a region of increased sensitivity. It doesn't show so much in this diagram, but part of it may be connected to where the clitoris, the internal part of the clitoris is, but there's also another set of glands that I'm going to show you in the next diagram to help explain why the G-spot or that increased spot of sensitivity is there. By the way, G stands for Grafenberg, the name of the man who claimed to have discovered the G-spot. Of course, it's a man. Okay, finally, kind of rounding out the diagram, here we have the rectum and the anus. As I mentioned with male anatomy, there are people who enjoy things inserted into their anus, into the rectum. For males, the prostate is an area with increased sensitivity that can be accessed through that route. But it's also, it produces pleasurable sensations simply because of the nerve endings in the anus. But also, those with female anatomy may additionally enjoy this kind of stimulation because something inserted into the rectum can also stimulate the G-spot. All right, I mentioned in the previous diagram that there are separate openings for urine and for reproductive purposes. There are a whole lot of people who think that urine comes out of the vagina, and if you look at this diagram, you can kind of see why. The urethral opening is tiny. It's very close to the vaginal opening, which is much bigger, and unless you actually could get up close, then it might be difficult to see. Also, while we're on this image, these are the rugae, the folds of skin that allow the vagina to expand. Okay, I want to say something before we leave internal anatomy about pelvic exams. Pelvic exams use something known as a speculum, which is two pieces of generally plastic, but it can also be metal, that are inserted in, and then there's something that allows them to spread apart. And this allows someone to look in between those two pieces to examine the vagina and particularly the cervix. So in a pap smear, what is done is that some cells are scraped, hopefully gently, from the cervix to see if they are developing normally. And then those are cultured, and then as long as they're normal, you're done until next year. The other thing that is examined is the cervix by feel, and they're also feeling for unusual growths in the uterus and the ovaries. And this is done by inserting fingers into the vagina and pressing on the abdomen. Now, the reason that these are so important is because cervical cancer is a very common cancer in women, And almost all of it is linked to a virus known as human papillomavirus, which is how we get the name pap smear. And cervical cancer is deadly. Now, when we get to talking about sexually transmitted infections, I'm going to tell you about HPV and vaccines that exist now, which will be fantastic for reducing the number of cases of cervical cancer. But it's only effective for people who have not been sexually active. So, very important for the generation coming up, but for generations that became sexually active before the vaccine, not so helpful. In any case, this is what it looks like when the cervix becomes cancerous, whereas this is what a healthy cervix looks like. All right.